Today, I am extremely excited to have on the show Garrett M. Graff for his new book, When the Sea Came Alive, An Oral History of D-Day. Garrett Graff has spent 2 decades covering politics, technology, and national security. The former editor of Politico magazine and longtime Wired and CNN contributor, he writes the popular Doomsday Scenario newsletter and hosts the Edward R. Murrow award-winning podcast Long Shadow. He is the author of 10 books, including the #1 national bestseller, The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11, The Threat Matrix, Raven Rock, and the New York Times bestsellers When the Sea Came Alive and Watergate, A New History, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. Garrett, how are you today?
I am great. Thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Your book is out in paperback. I believe that just came out last week.
Yes.
But I got to give a plug for the audiobook version, which is phenomenal because it incorporates, you've got actual speeches from like Eisenhower. There's like an actual team performing the audio. Really, I switched back and forth between the audio and the paper version. It was really great actually to listen to some of these accounts as I'm doing yard work and all that kind of thing. So plug for the audiobook as well.
Yeah. This is the second time I've worked on an audiobook with the same producer. His name is Scott Sherritt. And he is a maestro of sort of putting together these symphonies of oral histories with a full cast of speakers of various races and ethnicities and nationalities. And they did a fabulous job with When the Sea Came Alive. And the audiobook actually won the highest industry award for best multi-voiced podcast.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't put that in the bio. But I can't see the badge when I buy the audiobook on
Exactly.
all the awards that it got. Well, that's great. Well deserved, in my opinion. Well, the first question that I like to start off with for everyone who comes on the show is if you could just tell us, what is your book about?
Sure. So this is a oral history, as you said, of D-Day, and it is trying to tell the story of D-Day and Operation Overlord through the voices of the people who participated. So it brings together, in the end, I think it's about 700 different first-person accounts, all ranks, all units, German, French, British, American, Canadian, Australian, South African, and so on, to try to tell a very kaleidoscopic view of, what is probably the most audacious military operation in history. The invasion of continental Europe in the spring of 1944. The book came out last year, which was, of course, the 80th anniversary. We're talking now in June 2025 of the 81st anniversary when the book is coming out in paperback. And this book was inspired in some ways by a book that I did in 2019 that was called The Only Plane in the Sky, that was an oral history of 9/11 that, again, tried to tell the story of 9/11 morning to night, coast to coast, in the voices of the people who lived that traumatic and terrible day in the United States. Everyone from firefighters in New York and workers in the Trade Center to, people at the Pentagon, to those aboard Air Force One with President Bush, to, school children across America. And that book came out in 2019, which was, of course, the 18th anniversary of 9/11. And that was, as a historical moment, an important inflection point because it marked the moment where 9/11 was just beginning to slip from living memory into history. You had, at the 18th anniversary, the first people born after 9/11 who were going into the military and deploying to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that began before they were born. You had the first recruits coming into the fire department of New York, born after that day when 343 firefighters lost their lives at the towers. And my hope with that project had been to try to explain to this new generation who had grown up in their entire lives in the shadow of 9/11, but never actually known what it was like to experience 9/11. This D-Day book, I think, comes at the other end of that historical arc. And that's sort of the reason that I wanted to try to capture this project in a similar format for the 80th anniversary, which is, the reason that the 80th anniversary, I think, was so poignant last year is this is in many ways marking the final passing of that greatest generation. The youngest of the World War II combatants are now, effectively 100. And that what, for D-Day, you had 1 million Allied combatants on the move on June 6, 1944, across the English Channel and the United Kingdom. And, now we're down to, really just a few thousand of them left alive. And I wanted to try to do this book for the 80th because it marks the final moment when D-Day is passing from memory into history. We, blunt terms, at this moment, have every first person memory of D-Day that we will ever have. And so to try to tell this story solely in those first person voices, to put people back, in the troop transports, in the landing craft, on the beaches, in the hedgerows, of that day, of that experience, in the words and memories of the people who actually lived it.
Yeah, well, I think my audience is probably pretty familiar with the history of D-Day, but I do want to just start off with some brief history. Most of my questions are going to be like the questions of the story about the story. But could you just situate us here at the beginning about D-Day? What has led the Allies up to this moment for the landing in Normandy?
Yeah, and on the one hand, that's like a very simple question, and on the other hand, that is this enormously complex one. And one of the things that I that really changed for me as I wrote this book was, again, when I did that 9/11 book, there's exactly one chapter of the book that takes place before 9/11. There's one chapter about life on September 10th. And so when I started thinking about and researching this book, I was like, okay, I'm doing another oral history about a single day. I, might have a chapter or two about, June 5th. And then, the book probably starts the evening of June 5th and, runs through the evening of June 6th. And as you get into D-Day and understanding Operation Overlord and understanding the audacity of it as a plan and an operation and the complexity of the logistics, what you really come to understand is all of the success of D-Day takes place before June 6th. And it's in the planning, it's in the logistics, it's in the training. And so actually 40% of the book, it takes place before you actually get to June 6th. And, I sort of back up and tell this story of, Britain entering the war, America entering the war, and then the way that these two countries learned to be allies together over the course of 1942 and 43. We tell this story in history now of this great, allied alliance and, the incredible partnership between the UK and the US in this war. And that's where we ended up, but that's not where we started. And it really took a couple of years for the US and the UK to learn how to be allies. It takes a couple of years for the US to build up the industrial might that it brings to the battlefield in Europe. We have to move literal entire armies across the Atlantic to get them to stage in the United Kingdom, and then train them all once we get there. And that sort of so much of 43 and 44 are spent in this Herculean training effort to deliver the to get these troops ready to fight on the beaches when they land. And one of the things that we've now come to understand, and this is something that Peter Caddick-Adams, who's a British historian, calculated for his book Sand and Steel on D-Day, is that there were actually more Americans killed in the training for D-Day than there was in D-Day itself. And that, so one of the chapters of the book deals with Exercise Tiger, which is the last full-scale dress rehearsal for the units that are going to go on to invade what we now know as Utah Beach. And that, to give a sense of the scale of the training, the UK government actually basically condemns and evacuates an entire county in southern England, and forces the entire civilian population to move out, to create basically the practice invasion beaches that sort of look like the beaches that these units are going to invade in France. And then, they send full convoys out into the English Channel, and they turn around and then come back and invade South Hams in England. And in Exercise Tiger, this last full dress rehearsal for Utah, German PT boats actually get into the convoy in the night before the exercise invasion and sink multiple landing craft, torpedo multiple landing craft. And that it's this devastating moment for the Americans, both literally in terms of the lives lost, but then also the damage done to this incredibly small supply of landing craft. I mean, it removes the literal last spare landing craft that the US has in its invasion fleet. And it was an incident that was completely covered up by the Pentagon, for 40 years. And, the now believed death toll from that incident is around 700 American soldiers, far more than died on Utah Beach itself. But the truth is, we don't actually know the final death count, and that sort of some estimates are that it was actually as much as 1,000 final casualties from Exercise Tiger. And so the book tries to walk through all of these stages from the British evacuation of Dunkirk up through Pearl Harbor, up through the Battle of the North Atlantic to Exercise Tiger, and then the actual loading of the landing craft in the spring, in the sort of last week in May and first days of June in 1944. um, because so much of the drama of D-Day really unfolds in that part of the day
Yeah.
before anyone actually even gets to the beaches in France.
Yeah, and I love oral histories, by the way. And one of the reasons why I really like them is I love the firsthand accounts. And you just kind of alluded to this, but the the American the mythology around World War II from the American perspective is so strong, and it's so um, kind of one dimensional. And I grew up in like rural Northwest Indiana, and like the greatest generation, if you want to call it, I don't know, mindset, very strong there. Always grew up thinking like America won the war, like we saved the world. This was our war, this was our fight, and I really appreciated reading these accounts for how like not everything was just like sent down from God for the Americans to win this war. You just talked about how there were mishaps in training. Some of your accounts that you actually give on D-Day of the soldiers when they land, like some of them actually aren't like, I'm here to like, I want to go kill Germans and like, I'm really into that. And like some of them naturally scared for their lives. Some of them like feel like the Germans haven't done any harm to me. Like what, why am I here? So, I really love how in particular your oral history was able to do that.
Oh, thanks.
Um, yeah.
And I think that that's where you begin to be able to pull apart some of this mythology when you get down to these individual accounts. There were, I think part of this is when we write history, when we write narrative history, and I've written plenty of narrative history in my career and like it. Um, there's a tendency to make things seem neater, cleaner, simpler, and more preordained than any of the events actually felt for the people who were living through them. Coming back again to 9/11, the way that we talk about 9/11 in history books now is, there were 4 planes and the whole thing begins at 8:46 with the first crash and is over 102 minutes later with the collapse of the second tower at 10:28. And there were 4 attacks, and the Pentagon and the World Trade Center and the crash of United Flight 93 in Shanksville, and 3,000 people died over the course of the day, blah, 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 blah. But for any of us who lived through 9/11, like that's not the day that we experienced. We did not know when the attacks began. We didn't know when they ended. We didn't know for much of the day how many actual attacks there had been. And the original death toll estimates that day were like 10,000, 20,000, maybe even higher. And so when you tell the narrative, sort of straightforward factual history of a lot of these events, you take out the fear and the confusion and the trauma that is so central for the experience of the people who actually lived it. And so, as you said, have this mythology of D-Day as, one of the greatest, most successful, most noble military adventures in human history. That's not the memory of the people who were on board the troop transports, crossing the English Channel on the night of June 5th. That's not the experience of the people, of the paratroopers flying into, the drop zones with the 81st, the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. And what you see are people who are, scared. They're worried about whether they have what it takes to stand up in combat, whether they're going to let down their friends and comrades, whether they're going to live to see the end of the next day. And of course, for about 6,000 of the participants across D-Day, they didn't that next day. But you also see, and this is where I love a couple of the things that you mentioned. You know, a whole bunch of these soldiers are sort of pissed that they're invading Nazi Germany. You know, that they signed up after Pearl Harbor to go, kill the Japanese, and that they don't think that they are fighting the good war in Europe. There's, one guy saying, what has Hitler ever done to me? And we see these, we sort of impart this like level of heroism and courage onto these people in the abstract, in historical terms, that not that these people were not worthy of that, but that's not the experience or the emotion that they were feeling at the time.
Sure. Well, I'm wondering if you, I know the book was published a year ago, but hopefully some of these accounts still really stick out in your mind. Of the 160, how many accounts do you have collected in here? Did you say 160?
700, yeah.
700. Okay, far more. Could you share a few that really stick out in your mind as being interesting or important?
Yeah. So I'll talk about a couple individual ones, and then a couple categories. One individual that I tried really hard to tell his story through this book is Staff Sergeant Waverly Woodson, who is a black medic, one of the only black combat troops to land on D-Day. He was part of a anti-aircraft unit on Omaha Beach that was the only black combat unit to be involved in D-Day. And he gets ashore on Omaha Beach around 10 a.m. So after the first couple of waves have been, for the most part, decimated by German defenders, and is wounded himself before he actually even arrives on shore, and then proceeds on shore to treat the wounded of Omaha Beach for 30 hours before he himself is finally evacuated. He treats somewhere around 200 wounded on Omaha Beach, which means, if that number is to be believed, he sort of personally treats somewhere between 5 and 7% of all of the American wounded on Omaha Beach over the course of those 30 hours. And is one of the only black soldiers to be considered for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, in World War II. In the segregated Jim Crow racist army of World War II, not a single black soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Coast Guard, servicemen of any kind, receives the Medal of Honor in World War II. And history, has spent decades trying to fix that. And President Clinton appointed a commission that awarded a host of black servicemen medals of honor in the Clinton administration. Waverly Woodson was not one of them, because his personnel records had been lost by the time sort of history came back to reevaluate. And his unit in the First Army has spent years since, along with congressional representatives and senators like Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, have spent years trying to get him rightfully recognized for his work. He received a Bronze Star when in World War II for his actions on Omaha Beach, and actually last year, after the book came out, he was finally upgraded very belatedly to the Distinguished Service Cross. And he, the quest continues to get him, I think the Medal of Honor that he rightly deserves, but he is, at least I think moving into one of the stories that we try to remember from Omaha Beach, that of the sort of incredible heroism and gallantry on the battlefield there. One of the other things I really worked hard on in this book was actually to tell the Canadian story as sort of an overall category, which is, I think in the shorthand that we talk about D-Day, D-Day for most people means Omaha Beach, and, it means those first waves, that are the first, 10 or 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. And, that's true as far as it goes. But, there were 3 beaches that were not American, Sword, Gold, and Juno. And that even among those other beaches, the Canadian beach at Juno, I think traditionally does not get the attention that it should in historical terms. And as you sort of, you and your readers, or you and your listeners may remember, the Canadians bore the brunt of the disaster at Dieppe, and so for them as soldiers and as a country, there's this special emotional poignancy to returning to invade the European continent. And so I really wanted to try to make sure that the Canadians are at the center of the D-Day story as well, and was able to gather up some really amazing oral histories of the Canadian units that I think help reestablish that beach and its importance in the overall arc of that day.
Yeah, and how did you? I'm not 100% sure what goes into the making of an oral history. This is kind of a technical question, but how do you come across these accounts?
Yeah.
Is it all in an archive? Do you go out and interview people? I know you yourself made a trip to the beaches. Talk about that process.
Yeah. So this is I the answer is a little bit of all of the above, which is, for this particular project, I gathered probably 5,000 personal histories. And a big chunk of those came out of archives, both at the National World War II Museum in the US and then the Imperial War Museum in the UK. And then, dug up a lot of memoirs, local historical society interviews, TV specials, documentaries, radio interviews. Some of them are, a passing comment that a soldier made to a, correspondent for Stars and Stripes or Yank magazine at the time, in theater, up to, Dwight Eisenhower. And so, I take those sort of 5,000 and I go through them, and what you're really looking for, the way that I talk about it in terms of oral history, is when you're going through oral histories to compile a project like this, what you're looking for are the ordinary and the extraordinary. You're looking for what is the typical experience of a American infantryman in a Higgins boat heading into the beach. What is the typical experience of a paratrooper from the British Airborne, heading on a troop transport to, drop down and secure the eastern flank of D-Day. And then you are looking for the extraordinary, the truly atypical, one in 100,000 stories of weirdness or bravery or combat. I sort of course, gathered up a bunch of first person memories and from Easy Company of the 506th Infantry Parachute Infantry Regiment, which is the unit that we know as sort of the Band of Brothers unit, the Dick Winters Band of Brothers unit, and their story that day is some of the most incredible that we see. The units that held and fought at Lafayette Bridge, which is some of the fiercest combat that's experienced.
Some of the accounts I actually thought that people had of each other were very
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah.
Like I'm forgetting exactly. It might be this name sticks out because it's just a name that sticks out. I believe it's Private Malarkey.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
who, and I hope I'm not confusing him with somebody else, but some guys like, gosh, I saw him kill like 1,000 Germans or something. And it skips to his perspective. And he's like, I killed so many goddamn Germans today,
Yes.
or
Yes.
something like that. And I love just like seeing the perspective that people had on people that they were fighting with.
Yeah, and that was really, so once you sort of get that giant pile, then it becomes. I'm a Vermonter, and I talk about it in terms of it's sort of like boiling maple syrup. You start with a huge vat of sap, and then you just sort of slowly boil it and boil it and boil it. And so the first draft of this book was about 1.4 million words.
Nice.
And then, over months, I cut out 90% of that, and, got it down to, sort of the 160,000 words that it actually is published.
Now, here's a kind of a process question, but I think it's an interesting process question. I've had people on this show. I've been lucky enough to have several people come on and talk about World War II from a researcher perspective, especially in like a European context. The European perspective is just much different than the American perspective. The German perspective, the French perspective, obviously, very different wars. And so I've had people come on and talk about how it was very difficult for them, for example, to get information in French archives for Jewish relatives. Now, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
that's the Holocaust, but that's different. I've had a historian come on talking about Germany and talking about how it was very hard for those archives to be opened to do some of this research. And the answer that you might have to this might be a quick no, but did you have any obstacles in getting that research or getting these other accounts were, not quite as heroic as the American perspective?
Yeah,
Quote
I mean
unquote heroic.
the German memories are legitimately hard to gather. They are made harder by there is actually a very famous and well known and well sold um, book about the sort of oral history of the German experience at D-Day that most serious historians now believe is entirely fabricated. And so you sort of first stumble upon
Is
it and
this
you're like,
guy the same guy who wrote like 14 fiction books? Did he write like heroic books about Nazis way out in like the 60s or something? I could be
no,
forgetting.
I mean maybe there's another one, but the one that I'm thinking of is by someone who there's sort of no proof that this author actually ever existed at all. Um, and So you sort of first stumble upon it and you're like, this is fabulous, this is exactly what I want, and then it turns out no. um but there um I think there's been some really good work to gather some French perspectives, some good work, not as many as I would have liked to gather the German perspective. That was really challenging for a lot of the period after World War II, because the Germans didn't really want to talk about their experiences in World War II. And um, I um, uh, I found myself, for the most part, drowning in more than I could gather, um, or more than I could sort of read. Um, the Canadian perspective is a particular hole in this. There's been sort of large scale efforts to gather these stories on the US side, large scale efforts to gather these stories on the British side, less so on the Canadian side. Um, but I was able to get some really great stories, actually, from a Canadian journalist who wrote a book about Canada at Juno, who was just incredibly generous to me. And I called him up out of the blue, and because as I was talking about, with these stories slipping into permanent history, it is next to impossible to actually go out and gather new Canadian interviews. But he had spoken to a whole bunch of Canadian soldiers about 25 years ago, and he like went out into his garage, dug out his boxes of manuscripts, and went down to Staples and scanned them and emailed them to me so that I could draw upon them.
Well, before I kind of transition to modern day type stuff, any other accounts that, or not just accounts, but any information that in your reporting and writing this book, um, anything else that is new information in, like, D-Day has been written about extensively. Um, Anything like new or especially interesting that's worth mentioning?
Well, I think the thing that I really tried to make clear in this project was the sheer breadth of um, both the complexity that went into this, but also the real meaning of an allied effort. And to try to capture a lot of voices that people are not going to be familiar with as they dive into this story, to try to make clear just how broad and important that alliance was, as it was all coming together in the spring of 44.
Yeah. Well, for fast forwarding to where we're at now in history, you dedicate this book to history teachers. Why is that important to you?
Um, there's both a personal level to it, which is I am who I am today because I got interested in history early on as a student, and just love it. Um, but more broadly, at this very particular moment, I think as a country we would be well served to understand more of our own history, and certainly the complexity of our own history, than we mostly do.
Now, do you feel like I don't know if World War II is. I think I can say that it's like the last, in general, it's like the last war that America fought that there was like a clear good guy and a clear bad guy. Um, I think your book definitely like challenges a lot of the traditional narratives, but I'm curious if you think where we're at right now in history, if the narrative around World War II and our involvement is changing, and maybe for the better, but maybe for the worse. Maybe we're maybe we're taking the myth in a different direction. I guess I'm just curious in your thoughts, the modern state of how we teach World War II, if you think that's going in a bad direction.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that I thought a lot about is what we are doing as a country with the legacy that the greatest generation left us. That this is, this is a generation that not only fought and won World War II, but then set up the global America centric liberal world order that helped ensure that we didn't have world wars ever again. And by ever, I at least mean in the 80 years, 81 years since the end uh, uh, of World War II. And, we are in a moment where we are having a lot of conversations about what America is and what it isn't and what it stands for. And I think the simplest answer to that question is you are what you are willing to fight for. And I think one of the questions that we have to wrestle with as a country right now is, are we as willing as a country to fight for freedom and democracy and a stable world order now as that generation was in 1941 through 1945?
Not to get this is not a political show, but obviously, like war, it touches politics.
As Clausewitz says, war is politics by other means.
Thank you. I always love a good Clausewitz reference on this on this podcast. The other day I was, I've never, I don't want to get into the president of the United States too much, but he had said something that I actually think is kind of a common way of looking at the world around the country. In that the German chancellor was in his office, and he said that it was about to be D-Day. This is just last week, and and the president goes, "Oh, that wasn't a good day for you guys." And then the chancellor responds, "Well, actually, that's the day that our country was liberated from authoritarian dictatorship." And it got me thinking that we still kind of have this. Um, I don't want to reduce this to like a sports game, but kind of this mentality of like winners and losers, and not maybe not an understanding that you know. What's going on in Europe today, it's not quite as trying to think what the word I'm looking for is, but what I'm getting at is like a misunderstanding that there was like a winner and loser, and we can all go home and be friends now. What do you think that, as far as like attitudes on us winning World War II, where do you think that? Do you think that needs to change? Should it change? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So I think, um, so uh, you know this, but for listeners, I have another book coming out in August, which of course marks the end of the 80th anniversary of World War II. That is another oral history about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bombings. And August, of course, 80th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then the Japanese surrender on August 15th, and leading up to the surrender ceremonies with Douglas MacArthur on the Missouri on September 2nd. And the war with Japan in the Pacific was an entirely other struggle. In some ways, there is not that much linkage between, the Axis nations of in Europe and Imperial Japan in except that they were sort of both wars unfolding at the same time, with sort of the same alliance on the other side. Um, and I think, in a weird way, one of the things that we should be proudest of as a country about the legacy of World War II is the rebuilding of both Germany and Japan, more broadly Europe through the Marshall Plan, but that by the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and certainly by the 60th, Japan and Germany were two of the biggest, most powerful economies and democracies in the world. And that's an incredible legacy and testament to the hard work that the greatest generation put into not just the war, but what came after. And the thing that I worry about right now is, I think it is not a coincidence that we are watching a lot of the unraveling of that world order and the sort of democracy backsliding in the United States and overseas at precisely the moment that we are losing the greatest generation. That because I think we are losing the generation who knows how hard that work actually was, and who knows how hard it was to actually keep the peace in the way that it was kept. There's an Eisenhower quote from when he was leaving as president in 1960, and he says, you know, something along the lines of, the proudest thing that he did as president was keep the peace. And, by God, I can tell you that that didn't just happen, that they sort of had to work every day to keep the peace during his time as president during the Cold War. And I think I worry that we're going to really miss the sort of rules-based international order, and the sort of strong democracy movement globally once it's gone.
Yeah. Well, Garrett, this has been an excellent interview. I've loved your answers to my questions. My last question is about you personally, and I'm curious. For you, you write about in your epilogue how you've had a lifelong fascination with D-Day since you were a kid. How has your understanding of D-Day changed writing this book and going through the experience?
So I think uh, one of the fun things for me as a historian is the chance to go back to topics that I sort of would have told you I knew a lot about right up until the moment I actually started writing a book about it. And I wrote a previous history of Watergate. Then this book on D-Day is sort of two of those examples, where I grew up on D-Day mythology. I watched Saving Private Ryan. I read all the Stephen Ambrose books of the 1990s, and then when you actually start to sit down and write a book about a subject, you approach it with an entire other level of depth and intimacy. And it's I think one of the things I really came away from this project with is as much as I've talked about over the course of this podcast, trying to undo and peel back some of the layers of mythology that have been built up around D-Day, that D-Day actually deserves the reputation that it has. It is, this grand, audacious event that is unlike anything humans had ever undertaken before or since. It really was one of the most noble causes humans have ever fought for. An effort to liberate an entire continent from totalitarianism and authoritarianism. An invasion unlike almost any other in human history, launched not for conquest but for liberation. And I think in a lot of different ways, we should, as a country and as a people and as a democracy, be just as proud of D-Day as the mythology tells us to be.
Yeah. Well, we will end on that note. Well, Garrett, if people want to stay in touch with what you're doing, actually, where can they follow you? Do you have a website? Do you have some social media handles?
Yep. I am GarrettGraff.com. And I'm Vermont GMG, the state and my initials, Vermont GMG, on Blue Sky. And as I said, my next book comes out in August, and it's another oral history called "The Devil Reached Toward the Sky," an oral history of the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb.
Consider my pre-order pre-made then on that one. Well, Garrett Graff, When the Sea Came Alive, an oral history of D-Day. Now in paperback. Go buy a copy. Go check it out from your library. Don't discount the audiobook either, because it's incredible. And Garrett, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.